So we are with Robert Whitaker, Bob Whitaker. He is a journalist, he is a writer, and he have won several prizes along his career. And we are going to make this interview in English, and then we will translate it to Spanish with subtitles, and we close caption in English. So let's start, Bob. I read on Wikipedia that you have won several prizes as a journalist, as a writer, but something that caught my attention is that you was a cab driver for about 5 years. Is that a fake news? Is that true? How was that experience? What did you learn about cab driving?
That's a great question. I've done hundreds of podcasts, and it's the first time I've been asked that question. Yes, it's true. Actually, it was 6 years. I drove a cab in New York City at night from 5 p.m. to 5 in the morning. And this was it was from 1978 to 1984. This was a wild time in New York. New York was a really wild city back then. Fun, but wild. It actually had, and the reason I was doing it at that time, I was trying to make it as a fiction writer. I was very interested. I was writing short stories, getting a lot of short stories published, and then I was working on a novel. So the whole idea was make my money by cab driving and have some time to, write. However, I will say I had long wanted to be a cab driver in New York City. I first went there. I was hitchhiking, and I went there when I was, how old was I? 20, and I just fell in love with the city, and I fell in love with the nightlife, and I fell in love with a little bit of the romance of being a taxi driver. But here's the importance of it for the rest of my life. When you're a taxi driver, especially a taxi driver at night, but any sort of thing, the people in power are the people who are with money, are the people who are in your back seat. I start identifying as someone who labors for his living, a laborer, a worker. And it's a way to sort of, I was raised in a very sort of middle-class family, but it's a way to sort of gain an appreciation for class, how class affects society, how we move through society in different classes, that sort of thing. And when I was there, when I was doing this, gradually it became almost only immigrants who were cab drivers. I was one of the very few native-born Americans driving a cab by the end. It also, though, it affected me in this way. I sort of really fell in love with the rawness of New York in the early, at midnight, at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. And you saw people coming out and living sort of their wild life at that time, okay, in clubs and that sort of thing. So it really, I really appreciated, here's the bottom line and how it fits in. It made me start to see our society as an outsider, not an insider, from the outside, critically, through class things, and an appreciation for the people who were like living sort of outside the normal sort of social acceptance world, social, you know what I mean? That standards, because at 3 in the morning, people are doing stuff that you just are outside what we consider like acceptable or normal sometimes. And what else? I have to add one other thing, Alan. Even before I did that, I had 2 experiences that really cemented this perspective into me. One, when I first came to New York, I worked in what's called as a night clerk called a single room occupancy hotel. These are welfare hotels. It's for people who are homeless. They have a few dollars. There's drunks in there. Frankly, there's prostitutes working out of there. And I was the night clerk. And the reason I worked there is I got there, I had no money. When I first arrived in New York, I had like a few dollars. I went to this place, I had a few dollars for a room for a couple nights, and then they said, "You want to be our night clerk?" I said, "Great." What happened though, from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, that was my shift. All these people, addicts, prostitutes,
But
criminals, alcoholics, they came and talked to me. Okay. In fact, some of my first short stories were related to that experience. Okay. So now if you just sort of look at these people from the outside, you sort of condemn them or look down on them. If you're listening to them from 11 at night to 7 in the morning, you start to really appreciate them as individuals. And they could be funny, but they also had obviously stories often of extreme difficulties in life. I'll put it that way. So it made you like a bit of a denizen of the underground or of the underworld for a bit. But the biggest thing is, rather than seeing people with those descriptions through a stereotype vision, you saw them as individuals. Okay, if you understand what I mean.
yes, yes.
And then for my next thing, and these are the three things you really got to put together, because all of this came together when I became a newspaper journalist. My next job was working in the at the time known as the most violent prison in the United States, or the prison that housed the, the the worst criminals in the United States, and that was Attica Prison in upstate New York. And just before I came to work there, there had been a big riot, and like 40 people were killed, guards and inmates, etc. Now, so I go into this prison, and my job is to set up a reading program. So I work with people who can read and have high school degrees to be tutors for those who can't read, and to help them learn to read and actually get like a high school degree. Because the thought is, if they're ever released, they're going to need some education to rehab themselves. So you go in there, and in the United States, and I'm sure this is true in many countries, those in prison are seen as like the worst human beings, right? But of course, what happened when I was in this prison is most of the prison were blacks from New York City. Now that when we're in a white area, and so many of them, frankly, were there for related to drug crimes, selling drugs, gangs, gang fights, etc. And once you saw that, you saw, oh, here are people born into a situation in society where one of the things that's sort of a financial opportunity is running drugs. So again, it's the same thing. It humanized them. I came to like the people very much. I thought very many of them were, even those who were, many were very poorly educated, but very smart. And it was like, again, a chance to become intimate with a part of society whose members are usually rejected, they're outsiders, and they're seen as, they have a very difficult time. And yet I met them in a different way, as people what could be frankly warm, could be frankly intelligent, funny, but you could see that they had been raised in situations so often that, listen, selling drugs and getting into gangs, that was just sort of one of the paths that was open to them in life. So you add those three together, and it actually was great preparation for being a journalist, because we have a saying in journalism that your job is to afflict the comfortable, in other words, make the comfortable uneasy, and to comfort the afflicted. In other words, you really should be open to telling the story of people who are rejected by society or struggle in society. And those were the three experiences which happened over a course of really 10 years, 10, 11 years, that changed me completely. And I think prepared me to be a journalist that could be open to hearing and listening to people who normally don't have any sort of standing in society.
And Bob, you were about 20, 30 years old. That was your very first jobs.
Yeah, those were my first jobs after college. Very
Oh,
first job.
okay. And you remember some particular story about um, when you work in prison, or when you work in these little hotels, when you were a cab driver? Some particular story?
Oh boy, if you have 10 hours, I'll just ruin your
No,
ears for 10
very
hours.
short, a little one.
Okay,
Okay,
I'll
let,
start.
let me let me ask again. Um, in your novels or your short stories, you wrote about your experiences with the outsiders, the people in jail.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of such a story. In a way, the novel I eventually wrote was very much about this, but the novel I wrote, which I never got published, I had published a lot of short stories, is a story about someone who has become so enthralled with criminals, he imagines himself to be a criminal that can commit homicide, but he can never actually do it. But it's because he's been sort of intrigued by this possibility of completely changing his self. But I'll give you a very good example. There was a woman who used to come down and talk to me uh, when I was at the hotel, and she would spend hours with me. And I knew her. She was a sex worker, but she also was a sex worker at a club where she did dirty acts and stuff. And what was her name? She had a name that was so funny. But
Dancer,
well,
like
worse,
stripper. No.
worse, like simulate sex acts and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Okay. And I was pretty naive, and I forget what her stage name was now, but she told me her stage name, and like I didn't even pick up that this is just a stage name, that it was a pun because I was so naive. Anyway, and she developed a heroin habit, so she was also using heroin. Uh, and then she told me her life story, and her life story was so incredible. She had been an ordinary girl growing up in rural America, out in where we see that you think you might have a safe upbringing. She was in an abusive family, and then she got kidnapped. And she got kidnapped for days and was sexually abused by a group of men. And once that happened to her, it's like there was eventually no punish. The law couldn't correct that. None of those men went to jail, but she was also rejected by her own family as if this were her fault to have been kidnapped and abused in this way. And she was so now she comes to New York. She comes to without any money. And what can she do? Well, she can sell herself. And basically, rather than just work out on the street, because we had girls that worked out on the street, she worked in the confines of a club, which actually was a lot safer than working on the street. Okay. And I did write about this, and the stories about a naive person listening to someone else, and how that person who's speaking to you is in effect giving you such a gift because they're trusting you, and they're also but it's just such a gift to be invited into the intimate knowledge of a person's life like that. And now what eventually happened to this woman, you ready for this? She became a lawyer. She used that money, she saved some money, and one of the people who became like her protector was this alcoholic guy who had once been sort of wealthy and very sort of learned, but because of alcohol, he had been brought low. But he became a sort of her mentor and her sort of saying, "You can do it." And it took her about 4 or 5 years, but 4 or 5 years later, now by this time I'd stopped being that. I had worked in prison. Now I was back in New York, driving a cab. That hotel was in New York City. And next thing I know, I get an email from this man who had been an alcoholic. And he says, "Hey, do you know what happened to this woman?" And he was using a real name. I said, "No, she's a lawyer." And so she's a lawyer, and she went, I don't know, she left New York. Now, what does that story tell you? Well, it humanizes her. It also, one of the things I think, Alan, we maybe get into is when you're listening to stories, this person is not the other anymore. You know what I mean? It's just she's telling me a story within the larger confines of the human experience. Now it's way out on the spectrum, but she's not someone. So often we say this is one group of people and this is the other group of people. The prisoners or whatever it might be. All of this eliminated my sense of the other people who were so profoundly different. They had different stories, but their environmental lives were so different. But it also taught me this: is think about the resilience that woman showed. She shows up in New York City, broke, nearly homeless, and she took advantage of that's when she did the one thing that would bring her money right away. And then, she got herself straightened up, she got herself off heroin, and she became a lawyer. What does that tell you about the possibilities of people reinventing themselves? So that's what the story I think is in terms of how it influenced the rest of my life is I don't see people through this lens of the other. I don't whatever they might be doing. I see them as a human being who has a story, a unique story, that sort of thing. And you need to listen to the stories. But I also believe in the sense that uh, people do reinvent themselves. They are able to reinvent themselves in ways that make their life easier, more productive, that sort of thing. And finally, on this is people do suffer. Life is painful, but it is so often a part of life. So I can't tell you these things made me who I am. That's all I'm going to say. This became the philosophy that I have moved through life ever since.
And the short stories, they were published, the short stories in a book. What's the name of the book with the short stories?
No, there's not a
No.
book. What happens is in the United States, it's almost like you use these are literary magazines, either privately run or published by universities.
Okay.
And the universities aren't publishing, they'll publish anybody in the country. And it's always been known as if you want to build a track record that will allow you then to sell a novel, the best way to do it, it's very hard to get published, but is to publish in these literary magazines. So like I published one of the stories I wrote was published, for example, in Columbia. I think that was related to my time in the hotel, Columbia University. So I published maybe 20 such stories, and that's when and I did try to get them published as a collection, but I couldn't get them published as a book collection by a trade publisher. What they did do is they enabled me to get my novel that I finished read, and no one liked the novel, so that's when I became a journalist.
Okay. But you publish Anatomy of an Epidemic,
Yep.
and it's a very well read book. It's several. It has several editions, several reimpressions, and I want to ask about that book. Uh, when you referred, I didn't read the book yet because I couldn't buy it in Spanish. I didn't have time. But I have a question about this book. Um, that it will take us to Mad in the World. Um, when you publish Anatomy of an epidemic that it has a research and investigation about psychiatric drugs, the epidemic that you describe, it's an epidemic of abuse of psychiatric drugs, or it's an epidemic of mental illness diagnosis.
It's a good question. So the book is really around a question that is I raise in this. Okay. Um, First of all, I just looked at the number of people being disabled by mental illness. Okay. In other words, getting a government payment because they were disabled by mental illness. All right. And once Prozac comes to market in the United States, the numbers on disability begins to skyrocket. Okay. Prozac is an antidepressant. It comes on the market in 1987, and it's heralded in the United States and eventually around the world as this breakthrough medication for depression. It fixes a chemical imbalance. Okay. We get other drugs of this type, then we get new antipsychotics that are said to be breakthrough medications. We're told that they've discovered that depression, ADHD, psychosis, bipolar, they're diseases of the brain, and we now have effective treatments. That's the story that's happening in our society, and it's exported around the world. Now, normally, when you get new drugs that are very effective and counteract the pathology of a disease, in other words, they fix chemical imbalances, you're going to see the burden of that disease drop in society, because now you can diagnose it, you can get people treated, more people get treated for it, and the burden of that disorder, that problem, is going to decrease. Instead, what we saw was a great expansion in the number of people treated and diagnosed and given these new drugs, and rather than reduce the burden of the problem, the number on disability, and this was seen as like a marker of the burden of mental illness on society, it soared. It went from like 1.25 million adults said to be disabled by mental illness in the United States in 1987 to more than 4 million in 2007. So now that raises a question. If we have these effective drugs for diseases of the brain, why, as we use them more and more, are we seeing the burden of mental disorders go up? Now, what I then add with that question, why is this happening? I sought to investigate this. How do psychiatric drugs affect the long-term course of disorders, okay? Of a disorder. How do antidepressants affect the long-term course of depression? How do stimulants affect the long-term course of ADHD? How do antipsychotics affect the long-term course of schizophrenia or psychotic disorders? Now, at this point, I'm not challenging the diagnosis, whether it's valid or anything like that. At this point, I just want to see is, once diagnosed, how do drugs affect your long-term fate? And what you find is, on the whole, the drugs increase. This is research that comes together over a 60-year period, time and time again. On the whole, the drugs increase the likelihood that a person will remain chronically ill. That's number one. And two, increase the likelihood that they'll become functionally impaired. Now, what's key here, Alan, is it doesn't mean no one does well on the drugs. It also doesn't mean that the drugs can't help some people. Because the foil for this, the way you can understand this conclusion that it's making things worse on the whole, is you have to look at the natural course of a disorder. So if you take a group of people who are depressed, take a people who are equally depressed, and one group takes antidepressants and the other group doesn't, if you look out 2, 5, 10 years later, the group that didn't take antidepressants is going to be doing better on the whole. And for depression, for example, the long term, it's really in nature mostly an episodic problem, not a chronic problem. So that's the point with depression. Most people eventually got well at 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. So it's hard for a drug treatment really to beat that natural course of the disorder. So that's part of it. One of the books is actually seeing natural recovery rates. That's the first thing. Second thing you see is that the drugs lower that. And then the third part of this puzzle is researchers have noticed this. They don't make it public, but they, in their own in their own articles, they have said, we think we know why this is happening. And it happens to do because the drugs cause changes in neurotransmitter functioning. Your brain tries to compensate for that. And ultimately what happens is the drugs are inducing sort of an abnormality in neurotransmitter function. That's the problem. You can read it in the research literature. Now that's sort of the core of the book, but then it also goes into like basically the selling of the disease model that began in 1980 when the American Psychiatric Association published DSM-3. When they publish that, they're going to make it easier to diagnose depression. They're going to easier to diagnose bipolar, easier to diagnose anxiety, and they create ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, as a new disorder. So we have two things happening. We have more people getting diagnosed with very loose criteria, inviting more people to see themselves as mentally ill. Then they're told it's diseases of the brain, even though research hadn't supported that. And then they get on medications that, on the whole, lend themselves to a more chronic long-term course. So that's what the book is about. And basically, if you want to have a bottom line, it is, we in the United States organized our thinking around a false narrative of science, one that told of discrete diseases of the brain that could be that the pathology was known as chemical imbalances, and we could fix that. And that false narrative is what has caused so much problem, because it expands the number of people who get treated, that sort of thing. It makes the drugs misused. They can, there's plenty of evidence that you could use them short term and with a small number of people long term and get better results. And then we exported this around the world. So that's sort of the oh, and then I'm going to add one other thing. In both Mad in America, that was my first book, An Anatomy of an Epidemic, I said one of the problems with histories of psychiatry is we never listen to people who have been treated. And if you want to really have a history of psychiatry and some sort of assessment of the merits of the treatments, you also have to listen to those who are treated. So in Anatomy of both Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic, I said, if we as a society are going to think about this some more and how we can help those who are suffering, and I want to get back to that in a second, we need to listen to people who are struggling in this way. What do they want? What do they see who's help, rather than other people saying this is what you need? And I want to add one thing, because I think I'm misunderstood, and even Mad in America is understood. That false narrative has been harmful to society. It has also led to the drugs not being used in a thoughtful way. But this doesn't mean I don't think that people suffer. It doesn't mean I don't think these symptoms, whatever you want to call them, these states aren't real. And I also don't, it's not that we should not try to build societies that help reduce people experiencing that suffering or difficulties, but also build societies that help people regain their lives. Okay, so this is not psychiatric disorders aren't real story. That's not what I'm saying. It's that the narrative we've told about such struggles is a false narrative, and that is basically, we built a system around a false narrative, and that's the problem.
How did you arrive to the idea that Mad in America, it's one of your books, came to a web magazine or a blog spot or a blog? And what's the difference between a web magazine, a blog?
Yeah, it was conceived of as a web magazine, not as a blog. So a blog is like I go on and I just tell my thoughts. I'm an individual, right? But if you go back to what I just said about the problem was with an anatomy of an epidemic, we've organized ourselves around a false narrative of science. That means once you have that, we got to build a new narrative. We got to create a new narrative, one founded in actual science. That's number one. So how does society create a new narrative? One, it gets to know the real science. So what do? We have a team of science writers that are constantly writing about findings in peer-reviewed journals. And these findings are never promoted to the public because they counter that false narrative, okay? So you see daily science reports. Two, as I mentioned, I think we have to have the voice of those who've been treated with lived experience as part of any discussion to rethink psychiatry, rethink the system of care. So right from the beginning, we invited people, people with lived experience to tell their stories on Mad in America. So we're going to cover science. We're going to have people lived experience. And then we did want blogs, not just from me, but from people of all walks, maybe professionals, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, peer workers, family members, because it's a society that really has the responsibility of caring for the misfortune in its society, right? So you need all these voices to talk about what can we do differently? What's our problems? What are the failures of the current one, and what can we do differently? So we set up blogs, and that was sort of the vision from the beginning. Those were the three sort of foundational elements: science, lived experience stories, personal stories, and blogs for rethinking these things. And then once we got a journalism grant, we began doing our own investigative grants. So not a blog. It was meant to be an ongoing web magazine for rethinking psychiatry with those elements. with those foundational elements.
And do you remember the first one personal story that was published in Mad in America in the web magazine? And did you make yourself question about editing or not editing that personal story?
So the personal story was written by Laura Delano, who's very well known today internationally for her work related to psychiatric drug withdrawal and telling her story. Now, she actually played a key role in making Mad in America, the web magazine, happen. I had Mad in America as a personal website ever since I wrote my first book, and I'd put up documents. And one of the reasons I had a personal website is so I was telling a story beginning in Mad in America, which was science based, even though the public at large wasn't aware of that. So I put up all the key studies that I was citing to tell this counter narrative so that people could come to the site and see for themselves what those studies said. So as much as anything, it was going to be a repository of studies where people could verify what I'd written in Mad in America. So when Anatomy of an Epidemic was published, I did the same. I put it on my personal website. Okay. And I wrote a blog or two on that, but the website was really meant to be this repository. However, after Anatomy of an Epidemic was published, people began writing about, boy, we need to have a discussion, and then I said, well, maybe I can have guest blogs. The first guest blog was Laura Delano. And Laura Delano is this woman, very smart woman, who got diagnosed with anxiety or depression at when she was in eighth or ninth grade. Now, very smart, great athlete. And now she goes to Harvard. She graduates, goes to Harvard, gets on more and more drugs, gets diagnosed with bipolar. She tries to commit suicide and was very close to being successful with suicide. And now she's out of college. She's been told she's going to be a chronic patient. She reads Anatomy of an Epidemic and she says, oh, this is what happened to me. I was a normal teenager and I got diagnosed and identified as ill. Then I got treated as ill. And that treatment, that self-identity, plus the drugs eventually made her chronically ill and suicidal. So she read Anatomy of an Epidemic and she called me up. She said, she lived in the area. She said, can I meet you for coffee? I said, sure. And she said, is it possible I could actually get off these medications? Is it possible to live off these medications? And I said, sure, many people have gotten off successfully. You need to do it slowly and that sort of thing. And she did that. She got off, I don't know, probably in about 6 months. And she had a long list of drugs she had been on. And so now she wanted to tell that story to a larger audience. So actually, initially, I just published her as a blog when really it wasn't yet conceived of as a web magazine. But once I did that, I said, seeing the response to her writing was like, well, we need to build something greater. And so she became our first regular blogger and actually our first person we paid at Mad in America. She wrote for us, and then she became the editor of personal stories for Mad in America. And she also put together our first Mad Film Festival in 2014 or 15. So that's the first person. You can see why it struck me, because here was a person who had reclaimed her life. She's now married. She has 2 kids. She has the website Inner Compass. She lectures around the world about coming off drugs. So her story is a powerful one, and that was the first one we published.
And which was the first affiliated to now the network called Mad in the World? And what do you remember how this happened?
Yeah, sure. It happened because there was a group of progressive activists in Spain who were holding a conference. I think it was the INTAR conference, actually, outside of Madrid, about a little town, maybe 30, 60 miles outside of Madrid. And it was organized by a woman named Sarah Toledano. And I had met Sarah in Finland or something like that, and another Spanish woman who was writing for a magazine, and they did an interview with me. And there were no affiliates at this time, but they were talking about how do you change your system in your country? And I said, well, you could start a MAD in Spain. And what we'll do is we'll support you. We'll give you some resources in the sense we'll host the sites, we'll provide you with the software. But right from the beginning, the understanding was we don't understand what Spain needs. You'll have complete editorial control. We'll never seek to control it. So that was the sort of the template for affiliate. You find people you trust who do see a need to remake psychiatry away from the disease model. And then you say, you have trust in them, but you don't try to control their editorial content at all. And you can vouch for this. I mean, you have a very active site, but you've never heard me say anything about what you should or shouldn't do. Not once, right? I mean, I read your site, but not once.
Not once. I can shout it in public. Not once.
Yeah. So, and that's what happened. MAD in Spain came up, and they were the only one for a while. I can't even remember. Then the second one might have been MAD in Norway was the second. I'm not quite sure. And then once we had a second one, we began to see that MAD in Brazil might have been the second. They've been around a long time. And what happened there, this was sort of common. Paulo Amaranchi and Fernando de Freitas, they had invited me down to Brazil to speak at a conference, a sort of a peer support conference that they had developed. Spoke to them about, they had this need to sort of have another way to talk about mental health and build up people with lived experience. And I said, why don't you make a MAD in Brazil? So over and over again, Alan, you're actually the outlier. Generally, I had personally met everybody that became an editor. So usually I knew them. I had met them in my travels, that sort of thing. And I had met other people from Argentina that I can't even remember her name now, that were thinking about it, but then never decided to do it. Because I was asked to speak in Buenos Aires a couple of times. No, actually just once. But I knew these people from they had been in other conferences. So it had been talked about before, but you were the one who brought it together. But MAD in Spain was the first. Now, unfortunately, they ran for maybe, I don't know, 8-9 years. And they had, I don't really know what happened, but they're currently in limbo. Sarah, it was a group of like 6 or 7 people who were the editors. They had people with lived experience. They had some professionals. And they also had a political tradition that exists in Spain of a labor union. So they did everything anonymously. They wanted to be almost like anarchists, where you didn't highlight any individual name, but everything was done when it was done by an editor. It was MAD in Spain editors. Anyway, that group sort of fell apart. And right now it's on hiatus. They haven't had new content now for about 18 months, I think it is.
And I have information about the festival in Europe, in Greece. Can it say something about that festival, or we can't say nothing yet about that festival?
We can say this. So as we got more and more, so the way things initially functioned with the MAD American affiliates, there was no communication among the affiliates, okay? It was MAD America has a relationship with MAD in Norway, but MAD in Norway didn't have a relationship with MAD in Spain. So it was just like MAD in America is a hub and it has its individual spokes, but there's no wheel, so to speak. So as we got more and more, we said, boy, we really need to coalesce into a group, a network where we can share stories, share difficulties, share solutions, learn from each other. And, so we had that meeting in Copenhagen where we were hoping to have you come, but the travel expenses was, and the whole thing was so hard. You couldn't even fly there. I mean, it was right. It was like Argentina. It was very difficult to fly to Copenhagen. Anyway, we had that meeting in last fall, and it was really great. The sense of belonging to a larger network. As you know, we have monthly meetings now. I don't know how often you're able to attend, but we have these monthly meetings in affiliates. And at that meeting, we did discuss the possibility of putting together a film festival. And there might be some other things. We had a film festival in Boston in 2014, and it was very successful. And it was successful in a number of ways. One, we had films from abroad, and these were great films that, of course, weren't getting shown in theaters and all. But film is another way to tell stories, right? Different than the written word. And we had both stories that were being told currently, but we also looked at some past films, of that were, one was even banned in the United States for a time. And what we saw with the film festival is it expands your audience. A lot of people who don't want to come and read about this are want to see artistic presentations of this. So it really helped it expand our influence and our impact. Now, it was a lot of work to put this together, and it's a financial risk. But at this meeting in Copenhagen last fall, there was a proposal that in 2025, we would see if we could move forward with possibly holding a Mad in the World festival in Greece.
Wow, that's great. So, so exciting, Bob. Thank you very much. And what do you think about this challenge about show and offer society another narrative about madness? Do you think that films, arts, philosophy, uh, that we need to learn about films, literature, arts to offer another narrative?
Absolutely. Listen, this is the whole problem with the diagnostic and statistical manual that has been created by the American Psychiatric Association and exported around the world. It presents a view of humanity, of being human, that is completely at odds with everything we know from literature, theater, films, religious tracts. And by this, I mean this. It presents the world as that there's this line, and over there, the mentally ill people, okay, they're different. And on this side are the normal people. And over there, they have diseases. Over here, somehow we don't have diseases. But here's the most ahistorical part of it. Anybody who has read literature, anybody who has read Shakespeare, anybody who's been to the theater, anybody who's read religious tracts knows that human beings are very emotional creatures. We have ups and downs, we rage, we have jealousies, we're fierce, we're sad, we're happy, we're elated, we hate this person, we love that person. That's who we are. We are, and growing up is not easy, by the way. That's the other thing is you're born with some sort of mind and that evolves and develops in response to the environment, but you're sort of like a stranger sometimes to your own mind. Like, what the fuck is going on up here? Right? You're like, what are these things pulsing through me? Why am I behaving this way? Why do I feel this way? Who's in control up there? There's something, what's going on? And part of growing up is just like coming to terms with this wild world of emotion and thoughts and feelings. So you've really put your finger on the big problem here is we were giving a philosophy of being that says this is from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. If you have these swings of emotions, that's abnormal. If you're a little kid and you don't like to go to school because it's boring, I hated school, by the way. Then you have ADHD. You should be able to sit in your chair for 5 hours when you're 8, and then even go home and do some homework. Oh, and by the way, don't get in any fights on the way home or out in the playground or anything like that. Then you have ADHD. But that's not the range of who human kids are. They're not like that. So they do have behaviors that make them unpleasant with it. Some adults don't like it. But the same thing is like, anyway, the DSM gives us a vision of normality is that you don't find in any other, you don't find it in literature, you don't find it in religious tracts, you don't find it in novels, which says, oh, you should be sort of content all the time, and you should behave well all the time, and you shouldn't suffer, and you shouldn't have these times of difficulty. And they say the problem arises in your head. They don't even say the problem arises in response to your environment. Yet we are creatures who are built to respond to our environment. Change your environment, and often what's going on up here and in the heart changes. So you ask, do we need films? Do we need literature? Do we need novels? Do we need philosophers? Absolutely. Those are the people who should be presenting some story about how we help each other. And you know what else? We need the Quakers in the early 1800s. So before they used to say, so the idea was the mad, this goes back to the late 1700s, 18th century. The idea at that time was that the mad, by virtue of having lost their reason, had descended to a lower level of being. They were like animals, because the age of reason is what separated the humans from the animals. Okay, so they said, oh, you're mad, you've descended to a lower level of being, and there, once you have that, you can do awful things to those people. The Quakers at that time said, no, that's not right. What we know they are is brethren. They're like us. They are us. And as brethren, what is our job? Well, we don't know what causes madness, but our job now is to give them shelter, good food, exercise, help them work in the garden, that sort of thing, build a new environment for them. And the thought of the Quakers, now I'm not religious, but the Quakers was, inside them is a God-given capacity to regain their sanity. So they, rather than see people as the other, they're now brethren. And second is they have a capacity to sort of rejoin society as sort of a self-functioning person. So that's a very long-winded answer to say that everything stems from a philosophy of being, an understanding of what it is to be human. And we've been given a philosophy of being that is so impoverished. It just is not, it's not descriptive of what it means to be human. And if we're going to reimagine how to keep people well and how to help people who are struggling get better, get some sort of meaning in life, we need all of these. We need film. We need to look at film, literature, philosophers. Oh, and what I was going to say is, again, I'm not religious, but I do think if we talk about spiritual sense to life, okay, that doesn't mean I think there's a God I'm going to go fly up to heaven, okay? But it means, like, is there something so extraordinarily great about being alive, and that there's mysteries to being alive? So we need all of that incorporated into that humility, that awe, that wonder, and appreciation for people who in many ways are so different from us. Then you can read, and understanding that environment's so important, then you can start saying, like, well, how can we help ourselves be well, nurture our children, help them grow up, and also, when people do struggle, how do we basically help them move forward? Now, the final thing, I know what you're getting at with this madness. If you go into all this literature, religious tracts, often being mad was to be a seer, a shaman type person, someone who could see things the rest can't see. And I told you at the beginning when you asked this question, what did I learn from being a cab driver? What did I learn from being working with prisoners? What did I learn from being a night clerk? Well, I learned that people have stories to tell, and you're a better person when you can listen to those stories, no matter what they are. And to finish this, Alan, here where my office is in Cambridge, it's in the center of Cambridge, and there's a lot of group homes there. So what the group homes often do is they make the group homes are people who otherwise would be in a mental hospital, okay? And they often kick them out during the day, so they have to sit on benches and all. Well, for example, I'll give you an example. There was a woman who used to stand across from my office and scream about the killing of JF Kennedy, and just sort of classic sort of person screaming conspiracy theories and the CIA in her teeth and all this stuff. Dress horribly. On cold days, you could go out to her, she'd be screaming, shouting. I go, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? You know what happened the minute I said she wanted a cup of coffee? We'd go into the coffee shop. She wouldn't scream in the coffee shop. Okay. In other words, like, and then, she could start telling me her story. She did have a story that was meaningful. What happened to her that she was out on that corner? It didn't just happen. And actually, again, by listening to her, she was giving me, I was learning from her. Let's just say that. And yet you would have said, this is a woman who's out of her mind. What are you doing taking her into a coffee shop to have a cup of coffee with her? But the minute we sat down, it was fine. We would discuss things. Now there's a final thing to this story. She disappears. I don't know what happened to her, okay? She disappears. About 3 years later, I'm walking on the sidewalks in Cambridge, and this woman comes by and goes, she stops because, you don't recognize me, do you? And I go, nope. I don't. And she goes, oh, I used to stand outside your office and, scream, and then you take me in for coffee. I was, mind blown. She said, yeah, I'm better. I've got my own place now. I think shelter helped. And again, it just told me this possibility of like, we don't know what's going to happen to people, right? When they have these difficulties. But I think we need to appreciate for who they are at that moment, be willing to listen to them, and then also be aware that they may change. This may not be a permanent state.
That was Robert, the mad journalist Whitaker from Mad in the World Network and Mad in America. Thank you very much, Bob, for your time and your humility and your kindness. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for the questions. Were great. I really enjoyed it, Alan.